Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mr. Sauceda's YouTube videos. Today, we're going to be talking about evidence for evolution. So, we kind of know what evolution is now. We're aware of natural selection. We've talked about phylogeny a little bit. We've talked about a lot of different aspects of evolution. But now, let's go straight to what sort of evidence there is that evolution occurs all the time. First, but not, I was going to say first but not least, should be last but not least. But first and foremost, there we go, that sounds better. Fossils are just preserved remains of an organism. And what the fossil record shows is slow, consistent change for the most part. Now, there are some parts of the fossil record that show things happening very quickly, especially when you go back early enough. But generally speaking, what we see is slow and consistent change. So what we have here is a common ancestor to modern horses. And you can look at their skull shape, and you can see how it changes. And we can look at their legs and their feet, and you can see how they change over time. And what we find are that these fossils are found earlier in the fossil record, and then these are found later in the fossil record, leading us to believe that these were earlier and these were later, and these are in between, meaning that there is a common ancestor to horses. And so good old mudbray. That's kind of what we're looking at there. And so we find this kind of pattern for things like horses, whales, cats, etc. And so here's a crazy looking one for whales because they literally lose their legs and become aquatic. And so their, common ancestor, though, looks nothing like them for the most part, but it happens over the course of millions of years. And so, they start to get more elongated, and before you know it, they start to have flippers. And then before you know it, they lose those back flippers, and instead they end up with like a tail that has some other features to it. And so, now we end up with modern whales, and they still have a tiny, tiny little remnant of that pelvis left where their hind legs used to be. Good old, whaler. I almost said whale lord. All right. Now, new fossils often fill in common ancestor nodes. So we just said, much like a periodic table, we like to leave little blank spots for, possible common ancestors that we find later on. That would fill in some gaps. And so one of the best and earliest ones that we found was Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx is the earliest common ancestor of birds from reptiles, showing the progression of reptiles and birds. And so, it has, feathers, imprints of feathers. It's pretty crazy, but often we end up filling in spaces on our little phylogenetic trees simply by just finding more fossils and digging them out of the ground. We have biogeography. That's the study of the distribution of species over time. And what we have found is continental drift explains how isolated species evolve. So, as the continents separate from one another, the environment ends up being very different. And so we end up with very, let's call them uh, very different conditions. And as a result, the selective pressure from the environment might have been a little bit different. And so they evolve into different organisms over time. Or, right, it could be that maybe the food sources are different. Or maybe it could be that the weather is different. There are a whole bunch of differences that could accumulate over millions and millions of generations. And a good example of that is marsupials are only found in the Americas and in Australia. They're not found anywhere else. Good old Kangaskhan too. Good example since it's based on a marsupial. But we have possums. It's the only place outside of Australia where you'll find marsupials, and we have them in North America, and I think they have them in South America too. The fossil record also shows the distribution of species has changed over time. So we can go back, early enough, and if we go back earlier enough, or early enough, not earlier enough, go back early enough, we find fossils that look very, very similar to one another because, they were basically in the exact same spot. But then as the continents drifted apart, we start to see those species change over time. And so what originally may have been on both continents is no longer on both. Comparative anatomy also gives us a lot of background info. So the study of similarities and differences of the structures between species. And so we have a couple of different types, but we're going to talk about homologous structures. So homologous structures are organs that appear in different organisms and they share a common ancestry. So for example, this is our humerus, and then we have our ulna, our radius, and we have our carpal bones. And so dogs also have the exact same formation. Birds have the exact same formation. Whales have the exact same formation. Now look at the bones themselves. They look very different from one another, but they derived from a common limbed ancestor. So that's where that information came from. And so they could be limb bones, vertebrae, ear bones, jaw bones, etc. And a lot of times we forget that plants are also included, in this. It's just their fossil record is a little bit weirder because you're basically not getting any solid material like bone. Instead, you're getting imprints of leaves and stems, things like that, right? So, I mean, literally each one of these. So the poinsettia leaves, these are not flower petals, they are leaves. The little tiny spines that stick to you in a cactus, Venus flytrap, I'm going to call them mouths. I don't think they're mouths though. Pitcher plants, each of these are just leaves. They derived from a leafed ancestor, right? And they use their leaves for different purposes. All right, what about vestigial organs? So vestigial organs are organs that still exist but no longer serve a function. And so they're kind of an ancient remnant of when something used to work, basically. Human appendix, we now kind of know what the appendix does, but it was most likely used to house bacteria that aided in the digestion of cellulose. One of the kind of interesting things is that, herbivores, or things like, what's a good example of an herbivore? Rabbits have really weird digestive systems because they have to be able to digest cellulose and we don't, right? So they have, longer sesums and appendixes and things like that. Blind mole rats have fully formed eyes. They're just covered with skin, which leads us to believe that they derived, guess what, from an ancestor, a common ancestor that had eyes. Whales and pythons have a pelvis or a femur. Obviously, they no longer have back legs. And so you can see them right here, these two little bones. And again, that's just, vestigial organs. And there are a whole bunch of examples of organisms that have vestigial organs that no longer really serve a purpose, but you can tell that they were around from a common ancestor and they probably had a purpose at one point. Next up, we have DNA evidence. This is probably the strongest one currently, right? Because we're doing a lot of DNA work. And so this shows that, the more closely related an animal is to another one, the more similar their DNA is. And so it helps us fill in a lot of different things, but normally we can only do this for organisms that are currently alive. Ones that are extinct, they probably don't have any usable DNA that we'll be able to get out of anything. And DNA does have a shelf life. It does degrade. So that means that, the DNA samples that we do get from things like woolly mammoths and stuff, we're not going to get a complete set of genetic material. But organisms do share common genes and genetic code, right? We share proteins, we share processes, we share this translation chart, right? UCA will code for serine on any organism on Earth. Now, pseudogenes are remnants of older DNA from common ancestors that now do nothing. They're like vestigial organs, but they're hidden in our DNA. And there are a bunch of different examples of that, which is kind of cool. And so again, we can see how closely related we are to various different types of apes. And we can track back to some common ancestors where we had two-color vision because we had better senses of smell. And then slowly, as we get to three-color vision where we can see a lot clearer, we start to get worse at smelling things. And so the genes show that. And it's pretty cool that we're able to map that out. Also, direct observation. antibiotic-resistant bacteria, radiotropic fungus near nuclear test sites. That's huge. Pesticide-resistant insects. All of those things are fantastic pieces of evidence for evolution. So if you have any questions, please let me know.